the inmate who headbutted an abuser and left him bleeding in court, the father who charged at the serial killer who took his daughter, the uncle who avenged his nephew's brutal murderer. Courtrooms aren't always the center of decorum we make them out to be. In cases involving children, emotions can reach a boiling point, and restraint is no longer an option for the victim's family. Let's look at some cases where parents could no longer hold their fury back. James Henderson. This case, involving the murder of 5 family members together, was one of the biggest Cleveland had ever seen. The person responsible for this horrendous crime is James Sparks Henderson, who pleaded guilty to the killing of these innocent people in November 2014. This case takes place in Cleveland, Ohio, and the victims were his best friend, Jerry Taylor, 18, Lemon Bryant, 60, Shalona Williams, 17, and Jerry's pregnant mother, Sharita Johnson, aged 41. Johnson was 26 to 28 weeks pregnant. Her baby, Juwan, was delivered at a hospital shortly after the shooting and died 16 minutes later. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office said the child died of prematurity and ruled the death a homicide. For some sadistic reason, Henderson even took out his cell phone and snapped his own crime scene-style photographs of the bodies before fleeing the scene. It took 6 months after the senseless shooting, but Henderson was found with the murder weapon in his possession and was arrested at a nearby McDonald's. The victim's family were present for Henderson's sentencing, and their anguish was clearly visible on their faces. Delray Sanders, brother to Sharita Johnson, delivered a heart-wrenching victim impact statement. His voice was thick with grief and anger as he thanked the court for the opportunity to speak and showed his disdain for Henderson. He spoke of his shattered family, the burden of responsibility now thrust upon him, and the life completely altered by Henderson's actions. According to witnesses, Sparks Henderson repeatedly smirked as Delray Johnson spoke directly to him. The weight of his emotions proved too much to bear, and it was clear he couldn't contain his anger any longer. In a shocking scene, he actually lunged at Henderson after telling the 21-year-old to wipe that smirk off your face. Security personnel quickly stepped in and restored order to the courtroom. Henderson pleaded guilty and was punished with 5 life sentences without parole, in addition to extra 22 years for the attempted murder of a 10-year-old girl. The county prosecutor said at a news conference announcing the arrest that he had taken the death penalty off the table because Henderson had confessed to the crime. Deseen Brown has allegedly committed a double murder, but judging by his calm demeanor, it doesn't seem like he's too remorseful about it. And that's exactly what rubs the victim's father the wrong way. To understand what happened, we'll have to go over what took place in December 2020. This crime, allegedly committed by 23-year-old Deseen Brown, shocked the city of Cincinnati. The victims were Nitisha Lattimore and her innocent 3-year-old son, Nilo. The details are disturbing. On December 5, 2020, Nitisha was tragically stabbed to death. Even worse, her body was left in her apartment for several days while Brown ordered a body bag from eBay. He ordered an Uber, pretending he was transporting clothes, and then dumped her remains near the Ohio River. But that's not where this nightmare ends. Brown is accused of throwing Nilo, who was still alive at the time, into the river as well. The little boy's body has never been recovered. During the investigation, it became clear to everyone that this wasn't a random act. The fact that he ordered a body bag points to how this was premeditated. Even worse, he posted videos of himself smoking and dancing on Facebook later that night. Further along the case, the police uncovered his motive. Detectives believe the motive might be because of a previous miscarriage. Apparently, Nitisha had been pregnant with Brown's child, but tragically lost the baby. Brown allegedly believed she was responsible and decided to take revenge in the most horrific way possible. Brown was arrested and faced serious charges: aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. His defense argued for bipolar disorder as a mitigating factor, hoping to avoid the death penalty. A state law enacted in 2021 was intended to protect people like him. Bipolar disorder is one of 4 conditions named in the law that could make someone ineligible for the death penalty. But the Hamilton County Judge Megan Shanahan said even though he may have bipolar disorder, it didn't affect his capacity to exercise rational judgment or appreciate the nature, consequences, or wrongfulness of his conduct. and refused to rule out the death penalty. 3 psychologists who interviewed Brown offered differing opinions about whether he is mentally ill. One said that Brown doesn't have a serious mental illness. The other 2 testified Brown has bipolar disorder, but one said it wouldn't have affected his ability to know right from wrong. As proceedings continued, the pain became unbearable for Nilo's father, Antonio Hughes, who couldn't stand the sight of Brown. He suddenly lunged at Brown and had to be tackled by the security present in the courtroom. Sadly, this outburst resulted in a 7-day jail sentence for contempt of court. This isn't the first time he's done this. At a previous hearing, Antonio Hughes had to be restrained after physically attacking Brown during another court hearing. Currently, a jury trial date has been set for Decian Brown for January 2025. Jasmine Gordon. They say that the worst crime you can imagine has already been committed, in a way that's 10 times worse than anything you can think of. This is definitely true in the case of Jasmine Gordon and her boyfriend Clifford Thomas, who are responsible for the death of 3-year-old Jamila Smith. In late 2014, little Jamila was rushed to the hospital in an unresponsive state. One witness said that her daughter was not breathing, and Jasmine was panicking, refusing to explain why or what happened. The emergency medical technician said that she asked Gordon 4 times what happened to the girl, and that she didn't answer. The forensic pathologist said that there were abrasions on her right arm and healing abrasions on her forehead, along with her chest and upper and lower back. As if that wasn't horrifying enough, the pathologist also testified that the child also suffered from internal bleeding in the head, stomach, and a torn pancreas. Their defense team argued that the child might have inflicted these abrasions on herself, but these justifications were quickly shot down by the experts. These weren't the type of injuries a toddler could inflict on themselves, no matter how clumsy they may be. Prosecutors believe Gordon and her live-in boyfriend Thomas are responsible for 50 injuries found on Jamila's body. Gordon broke down in court, but prosecutors claim she did nothing to save Jamila, who would have shown symptoms of sepsis that ultimately led to her death. Jamila's father, Dwayne Smith, testified a few weeks prior after her mom dropped her off. He noticed Jamila limping with bruising on her leg. Gordon claimed it was a rash while he contacted CPS, but didn't hear anything back. At this point, the memories might have been too much for Jamila's father to bear. Smith was getting ready to give a victim impact statement when he punched one of the defendants, Clifford Thomas, in the head. Wayne County Sheriff's Office deputies quickly separated the two, and yelling can be heard throughout the courtroom. Luckily, no charges were pursued against him, as the judge declined to hold Smith in contempt of court. Ultimately, both Gordon and Thomas were convicted. Jasmine was given consecutive sentences of 7 to 15 years for involuntary manslaughter and 14 to 25 years for first-degree child abuse, while Thomas was sentenced to about 6 to 15 years for involuntary manslaughter and 1 to 2 years for resisting and obstructing a police officer. Davon Mochwain. On November 9, 2022, Darius King Grigsby's family was shattered. The innocent 9-month-old became an unintended victim of a drive-by shooting. Baby Darius was being pushed in his stroller by his mother, who was walking along with a male friend when shots were fired. While the bullets were intended for her friend, her baby was the one who ended up being killed months before his first birthday. The shooter then fled the scene. 8 days later, Devon Mochwain, who was only 18 years old, was charged with the murder of Darius. At first, he pleaded not guilty, despite the weight of the evidence against him. Later, he confessed, revealing there might have been accomplices, but refused to identify them. As Mochwain's trial proceeded, something truly shocking went down. James McRae, another inmate awaiting trial for a separate crime, lunged at Mochwain and let down a barrage of punches on his head, even striking Mochwain with his elbow. He was quickly apprehended by the sheriff's deputy present at the scene. While some, perhaps understanding McRae's potential empathy for the bereaved family, applauded his actions, he himself was charged with fatally stabbing a 40-year-old man. Mother Monica Ayala says she had to make herself leave the courtroom as it happened, and said, "Me personally, I would have joined, so I couldn't stay. I had to walk out and cry and calm down." Ryan Burge. Imagine leaving someone with your child, the most important person in your life, just for them to betray you in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Ryan Burge, who was tasked with watching 5-year-old Hartley Anderson, stood accused of a terrible crime, her murder. On November 2, 2018, an ordinary day turned into a nightmare. Burge, who was her mother's 37-year-old live-in boyfriend, was supposed to be babysitting Hartley while her mother worked and siblings attended school. The details surrounding Hartley's death aren't clear. Burge claimed she had a tantrum and repeatedly banged her own head against the wall, but his explanation was far from believable. A neurosurgeon at the Children's Hospital said that Hartley suffered a stroke and massive brain swelling and asserted that the injuries to her head could not be self-inflicted. Hartley's family sat through the emotionally charged trial. Burge was dressed in a suicide smock as the court decided he was a danger to himself, while Hartley's mother collapsed and had to be lifted out of the courtroom. The prosecution accused Burge of a violent attack fueled by uncontrollable rage, while the defense stood by their position that this was a case of self-harm. This idea was just too preposterous for her family to handle, and things came to a boiling point. Hartley's father attempted to lunge at Burge in a moment of grief, but he was restrained before any harm could be done. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, made worse by the fact that Burge pleaded not guilty. Ultimately, the jury did find Burge guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Lacynthia Tidmore. Lacynthia Tidmore is a 25-year-old from Garfield Heights, and in 2017, she made a heartless decision that changed a family forever. Tidmore was responsible for a hit-and-run that killed a 9-year-old girl, Desire Mays. The child was walking toward the bus stop so she could go to school. It was the first time her mother had let her go by herself, believing the area to be safe enough for her daughter, as well as practicing crossing the street 1 week prior. But as the young girl crossed the street, Tidmore, who was speeding, struck her. The girl suffered multiple injuries, including a broken neck. Rather than to call an ambulance or at least try to save the little girl, Tidmore fled the scene and left Desire to die under horrific circumstances. Tidmore then stopped at a gas station in Cleveland to get gas and joked with the clerk, who was related to the girl's family, about the damage to her car. She even called a tow truck and went to work as if nothing happened. But later that day, she called police to arrange her surrender after a woman at the scene followed her to the gas station and called the police on her. Prosecutors say telephone records showed that Tidmore was using her cell phone at the time of the crash. Desire lived for 15 days in the hospital before she eventually died. While the victim's mother restrained herself physically, her emotional victim impact statement in the court shook even the hardest of hearts. She detailed the pain and suffering her daughter endured in her final moments, as well as recounting how much Desire was loved and valued by everyone who knew her. Her anger and pain could be felt by everyone in the courtroom as her lawyer comforted her, saying, "Take a deep breath, Desire will give you strength." Through the trial, Lacynthia was poker-faced as Mays shockingly recounted a confrontation that took place at a grocery store where the suspect at the time actually laughed in her face before she, her boyfriend, and her sister assaulted her. The marks of the assault visible on her left eye during the statement, it became abundantly clear Tidmore had no remorse for what she's done. Lacynthia was charged with aggravated vehicular homicide and failure to stop after an accident, which carries a maximum sentence of 8 years. Tidmore apologized in court but maintained that she didn't stop because she didn't think she hit a child. But the apology wasn't good enough for the victim's mother, who stated in strong words that she only did it to make a show, and it was impossible to not notice a 70-pound child rolling over your windshield. Even worse, Tidmore is a mother herself. The fact that she could do something so cold to someone else's child makes her 8-year jail sentence look petty. Quinn Bowes. When you have a child, you want to do everything in your power to protect it. Sadly, not every parent has that instinct. A small Indiana town was shaken by the death of 3-month-old Parker Bowes. Poor Parker was found lifeless, his tiny body bearing the marks of blunt force trauma. At first, nobody suspected his family, but the truth ended up being harrowing. The perpetrator was none other than Parker's own father, 23-year-old Quinn Bowes. Quinn was arrested and faced a possible 40-year sentence for first-degree murder. Strangely enough, the trial was canceled and a plea deal emerged. Quinn agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge, domestic battery resulting in death, in exchange for dropping the more serious murder charge. So, instead of 40 years, he received a 25-year sentence, with 19 years in prison and the remaining 6 on probation. He was also ordered to pay for the child's funeral expenses. Now, imagine the emotional turmoil in the courtroom. As Quinn was being led away, the baby's uncle, Matt Hartley, was understandably angry and frustrated. In a moment caught on camera, Matt lunged at Quinn, attacking him and knocking his glasses off. You can clearly see Quinn shielding his face from the attack, which left him bloodied. This outburst landed Matt with a misdemeanor charge and 179 days in jail for contempt of court. Christopher Elwell. We all know what happens to people who abuse children in prisons, but sometimes it can happen before they go to prison too. Christopher Elwell, 29 years old, was convicted of sexually assaulting a 4-year-old girl. For this horrifying crime, he was sentenced to 7.5 to 15 years in prison. Shockingly, this isn't his first time doing something so depraved. Back in 2008, he engaged in sexual acts with a minor when he was 20, so this seems to be a pattern with him. Christopher at first denied the allegations, but he later confessed to them in court and pleaded guilty to failing to register as a sex offender, a requirement from a prior conviction in 2008. He was given 15 years in prison. As Elwell sat on the benches at the back of the courtroom after his sentencing, he was headbutted twice by Josiah Davies, who was also sitting on the same bench. In the video, he seems to have struck Elwell's jaw twice, but he was restrained before he could go for strike 3. Davies is a pre-trial inmate at the Stratford County House of Corrections, who was scheduled to appear in court for his own hearing. Apparently, he was a convicted check forger who committed a slew of other forgeries, but nevertheless, something about the Elwell case triggered something in him. Both Elwell and Davies ended up having their hands and feet shackled. Davies was sentenced 2.5 to 6 years in prison for the attack and other crimes. Michael Madison. Every parent knows that even after your child becomes an adult, you'll still see them as the little humans they once were. This sentiment is painfully evident when Van Terry, father of one of Michael Madison's 3 victims, leaped over a table in a Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court to attack the defendant. Just moments before, the judge had pronounced a death sentence, a verdict that couldn't erase the unimaginable pain. Usually, serial killers have a troubled past, and Michael Madison's story is no different. Drug convictions plagued him from the early 2000s, but 2002 is when he started carrying out more depraved crimes. He was convicted of attempted rape and was registered as a sex offender. This, for some weird reason, made him escalate his crimes even further. On July 19, 2013, the extent of the atrocities that he had committed were finally uncovered. A foul odor came from a garage he leased. A smell that was so terrible it led people to fear the worst, and it was reported to the police. Their fears were right. The police found a decomposing body hidden inside. The law enforcement officers quickly searched the area for any further evidence. Suddenly and tragically, 2 more bodies were discovered, one in a backyard and another concealed in the basement of a vacant house. The proximity of the bodies, all found within 100 to 200 yards of each other and wrapped in plastic bags, implied premeditation. This was far from random. The entirety of East Cleveland was alarmed as headlines of a potential serial killer were everywhere. 3 bodies had already been found, and investigators, after talking to the suspect, feared there could be more. All women, all vulnerable, all silenced. Police, the sheriff's department, and even the FBI joined forces in a race against time. The victims were identified as Shatisha Sheely, a young woman of 28 who had disappeared in September 2012, along with Angela Deskins, a 38-year-old resident of Cleveland, was reported missing in June 2013, and Sherelda Helen Terry, an 18-year-old who had just begun a summer job at a local elementary school and had disappeared on July 10, 2013. Michael Madison was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder in July 2013, his bail set at $6 million. The trial commenced 3 years later, in April 2016. During the trial, prosecutors played a recording of statements that Madison made after his arrest. He told police during an interrogation that he strangled 2 of the women during fits of rage. His defense attorney didn't dispute that Madison killed the women, but he said Madison didn't plan the killings and that they happened during spontaneous bursts of violence. Throughout the proceedings, however, Madison seemed unbothered. showing no remorse for the devastation he had caused. This utter lack of empathy was too much to take in for the victims' families, particularly for Van Terry, the father of teenager Sherelda Terry. During his victim impact statement, Terry turned back to look at the monster who hurt his daughter and paused for a moment. It was clear that he was planning on doing something. Suddenly, Terry lunged at the defendant, throwing his entire weight directly on Madison. A security guard got in the middle of the altercation and held Terry back. The cries of the traumatized family could be heard in the background as he's apprehended by the guards. Thankfully, many in the courtroom understood his emotions were at a high, and Terry faced no charges for his outburst. Justice, though imperfect, was served. Michael Madison was found guilty on all 13 counts against him, including aggravated murder, felony murder kidnapping, and felony murder rape. There is nothing that comes close to the pain of losing your child in unfortunate circumstances. It's understandable why some people cannot restrain themselves when faced with those who caused unimaginable harm to the most vulnerable people in their lives. We hope you found the video informative, and we would love to know your thoughts on these courtroom attacks. Should the decorum of the courtroom be followed in such circumstances? Or should there be more restraint? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section, and before you leave, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Criminal Corner so you don't miss the next ones.